Good day. I wanted to follow up with our perusal and small group discussion on Thomas Merton's The War Within Us. And one question that begs to be asked is, why wouldn't you choose life? Why would you ever choose death? And of course, there are many different reasons. But let's just explore one particular issue as a case study: teenage drinking. Teenage drinking. So now think for a minute, what did you know about drinking as a sophomore? What what did you understand? You probably were in middle school and you heard the DARE presentations and some of the consequences of what could happen if you were drunk and you drove. You maybe heard some testimonials of some of your classmates talking about it. And so you knew some things about drinking, but there was a lot that you didn't know. You may not have had firsthand knowledge. You may not even have had secondhand knowledge. And you may have heard some things, but they weren't rooted in reality. But yet, of course, you still had to make decisions about whether or not you were going to drink. Now let's fast forward to this year, and hopefully you'll get to experience a graduation like this, where you're all together and you get to, shall we say, throw your proverbial hat. You don't do that at SLU with your tuxes. And the question becomes, so you know more about drinking, I would say. You may have had some secondhand, even firsthand experiences, and you've learned about the effects in some of your classes. And yet, with this knowledge, the decision that you have to make doesn't necessarily feel easier, does it? Sometimes it's even more of a burden, right? The knowledge or understanding that you have, or the awareness, it feels like more of a burden. So interestingly enough, just because you know more doesn't appear to make the decision feel any easier. And I think that's one reason why. Another reason, of course, is brain development. We're going to get a little into that in your second quarter when we talk about it, is that your brain is still under construction. And that affects the decisions that you make. All right, let's talk a little bit more about contemplation. So I asked you to read for today's class, Learning to Be Alone from Thomas Merton. And then during class, you read the course notes on contemplative prayer. So let's get into it. So first, really, learning to be alone, I had to read that because I wanted you to give you a rationale for why do we need contemplative practices. And what Merton says in his piece, Learning to Be Alone, is that we need those contemplative practices because what? They help us to find our true selves. They help us to be more fully alive. They help us to be free. They help us really to pay attention to what's going on in our lives. Just think about how tempting it can be just to go through the motions. Contemplative practices are one way to help us to pay attention. The examen really is a contemplative practice, isn't it? We take a pause, we take 2 minutes out of the day, and we ask for God's grace to reflect on our day and how is God present. That's a contemplative practice. We're pausing, we're paying attention. So how do we do this? Well, one could be the examen. There's so many different ways. Today we're going to try just one. We're going to try centering prayer. So centering prayer is something that I'm familiar with. I've been trying to practice centering prayer on a daily basis, actually 2 times a day, for about 5 years. And my experience is like any novice. Even with doing it 5 years, I'm still a novice. In that many times when I go down to pray, I fall asleep. Or many times when I pray, I go through my resentments. I think about what I'm worried about. I obsess about something. And then there are also times where I'm very peaceful. So just know that your experience is going to be all across the board with centering prayer. So let's talk a little bit about the course mechanics or the mechanics of how to do it. So, centering prayer is not analyzing, is not reflecting. It is just being with God, just being with God. And we'll see how we do on that. There are many different techniques. This is some of the most common strategies. One, we pick a device, kind of like when you're on a camping trip and you just focus on the fire in front of you. A device helps us just to pay attention, to just be. And I suggest you pick a word. Mine is yes, so that I say completely yes to God's will. Second, we have this intention, like my intention is just to be present with God, to notice how God is present and active in my life. Third is that we just notice what comes up. We pay attention. A lot of times it's going to be different thoughts. It's going to be feelings, reflections. That's okay. And just come back to that word. And then last but not least is, as Merton said, in Learning to Be Alone, we don't go off to be by ourselves just for that end goal. We do it so that we can actually be more loving in our life. And so we do this so that we try to be more present and attentive to how the people in front of us and God. Little history. Contemplative prayer is certainly part of the Catholic tradition. Here in the Catechism, paragraph 2724, it talks about contemplative prayer is fixing our gaze on Jesus, directing our attention on Jesus, kind of like St. Ignatius invites us to look at Jesus, the crucified Jesus, and ask, what more can I do for Christ? Also, it's about being attentive, and it's really an exchange of love. A couple other thoughts on contemplation, one from Father Walter Brughardt, Jesuit homilist, theologian. He said, contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. So we're going to be present to the reality of our lives, the good and the bad, and that will, in a sense, free us.